We begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. In the series of Why Islam, I'm now talking about the sources of learning Islam. In the last two presentations, I talked about the Quran, and today I'm going to talk about the second pillar source of learning, that is the Sunnah. Unfortunately, unlike in the case of the Quran, in the case of Sunnah, Muslims are not in complete agreement on what constitutes Sunnah. Now, if that's the case, then we are left with no choice but to look at each point of view carefully and find out as to which of them is making more sense. The first point of view, I'll talk about three of them. The first point of view is the most popular understanding amongst Muslims, according to which Sunnah are the practices of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, his statements, and whatever happened in his presence which he silently approved. So, no matter what the Prophet did, it constitutes Sunnah. There are many arguments which people who belong to the category of those who think that this is what Sunnah is, they present. For example, there is a famous passage in Surah 53, Surah An-Najm, wherein the Almighty says about the Prophet that وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْحَوَىٰ, he doesn't speak out of his own desire. In huwa illa wahyun yuha. Whatever he says, presents, is a revelation that has been revealed to him. So the argument is that if everything that the Prophet of God, God's mercy be on him, does is based on divine revelation, then obviously it is all from God to be followed, emulated by the believers. Another argument presented is from verse 30, from Surah 33, verse 21, which says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ, indeed, in the example of the Prophet for you, O believers, uswatun hasana, is a glorious example. That is, the life of the Prophet is a model for all Muslims to follow, and therefore, these people who believe that this point of view is the right one think that we've got to go into the details of what the Prophet used to do in his life, and we would do well to follow each one of his examples as best as we can. There are others who believe that this point of view is not correct, and they mention a number of passages of the Quran to show that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, despite being an excellent example of a very devoted servant of God who always followed what the Almighty asked him to do, yet he was corrected by the Almighty in some of the things that he did. One example that is mentioned is from chapter 9, verse 43, wherein the Prophet, out of his kindness, generosity, forgiving nature, he allowed some of the hypocrites about whom he was not aware that they were hypocrites to stay back in Medina, even though the instructions were that all able-bodied men, Muslim men, were to leave Medina, the city of Medina, to fight against the enemy in Tabuk. The Almighty says in this verse, Afallahu anka, O Prophet, may God forgive you, lima azinta lahum, why did you permit them? So what they say is that the claim that whatever the Prophet said was based on divine revelation doesn't seem to be correct. They also give an example from the life of the Prophet when he migrated to Medina from Mecca, and he saw that the people of Medina were engaged in an exercise which is described as crafting date trees. They were used to doing it over hundreds of years, and as a consequence of their experience, they knew that as a result of this exercise, they have better date crop. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was new to this technique, and he commented by saying, "What if you don't do it?" It was a passing remark, but many of the companions thought that it was another religious instruction that was given to them, and they did not go through that exercise that season. And the crops came down, and there were some people who approached him, telling him that they followed his instructions, and the crop went down. And he remarked, he said, "It was just my observation. You know worldly matters better than I do. When I tell you what God says to you, I am telling you the truth." So, this remark of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which is there in many authentic books of hadith, is employed by the people who disagree with the first point of view. And they say that the Prophet himself has clarified that worldly matters are a domain which Muslims should sort out in light of what they have learned, what they have experienced. They also say that there are many practical problems that would emerge if the first point of view is to be followed. Many pious people would insist that they would rather travel on camelbacks or horsebacks, etc., rather than to travel on cars and aeroplanes. And likewise, many similar problems would arise if it would be insisted that everything that the Prophet did belongs to the domain of religion and constitutes Sunnah. The second point of view is the other extreme, which says that there is no religious instruction given to us Muslims in the category of Sunnah. It is only the Quran that we Muslims are expected to follow, and the Quran suffices for all guidance that is needed by us. The arguments that they present include a verse in chapter 5, verse 67, wherein the Almighty is asking the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, "Balligh ma unzila ilayk." You convey to them whatever has been revealed to you. For if you don't do it, you will not have discharged your prophetic obligation. So they say that whatever was revealed to the Prophet is what we find in the Quran, and he has delivered it diligently to the entire Ummah, and his job has been done. They also say that the last verse, verse 110 of chapter 18, Surah Al-Kahf, says, "Qul innama ana basharum mithlukum." Tell them, I am a human like you. Yuha ilayya. Divine revelation has been revealed upon me. That is, the only difference between you and me is that I have been gifted with divine revelation, which according to them is what we find now in the form of the Quran. This has been delivered and the Prophet's job has been done. They also say that the Quran mentions in chapter 6, verses 154, 155, that the book of God carries tafsil al-likulli shay, details of everything. So that when the book contains details of everything, we do not need any other source for us to be guided from. Those who do not accept this point of view mention a few passages of the Quran that clarify that the Quran itself is clearly mentioning that there was guidance provided by the Almighty to the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which we do not find in the Quran. For example, they mention a number of verses of the Quran that talk about prayers, formal prayers. They talk about doing Hajj, but never mention how formal prayers are to be said, never mention how Hajj is to be done, etc. So they say that while on the one hand, the Almighty is requiring us to go through certain expectations, on the other hand, the Quran is almost completely silent about how to do them. They mention, for example, verse 58 of chapter 24, Surah Nur, wherein the Almighty talks about 3 durations of privacy of couples, during which time, if even children are to enter their rooms, they have to seek their permission. While talking about those 3 durations, 2 of them, the Quran mentions min qabli salatil fajr, before the Fajr prayer, and the other is wa min ba'di salatil isha, after the Isha prayer. So those who reject this understanding of people who would like the understanding of Islam to be confined to what is mentioned in the Quran only, they say that had your understanding been correct, then there must have been a clear mention in the Quran of what is Salatul Fajr, the Fajr prayer, and what is Salatul Isha, the Isha prayer. The Quran mentions their names, but doesn't mention what they are. What are their timings? What are the details? Therefore, this point of view has to be incorrect. The third point of view claims that Sunnah, like the Quran, is an important, independent pillar source of knowledge in learning Islam. It says that the Quran has clearly asked the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, to follow the way of Abraham, the religion of Abraham. So the verse says, verse 123 of Surah 16, ثُمَّ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ, then we revealed upon you our message, O Prophet, أَنِ اتَّبِعْ مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا, that you follow the religion of Abraham, who was devoted to the Almighty's message completely. They ask, what was that religion of Abraham? Of course, it was not the Quran, because the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. So, the religion of Abraham was formal prayers, as-salat, as-zakat, al-hajj, as-sawm, etc. All these rituals and many other practices which we go through were the ones which Abraham also went through. And the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was asked by the Almighty that he too should go through them. They say that Sunnah is only religious practices. Sunnah cannot include anything that has to do with personal likes and dislikes of the Prophet, or the ways and means he adopted during his lifetime because he lived in a particular locality, geographical area, and in a particular era. The religion is what prophets were expected to deliver. And they quote verse 13 of chapter 42, wherein the Almighty has mentioned 5 most prominent prophets, messengers: Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Prophet Muhammad, may God's mercy be on all of them. And has mentioned, the verse mentions, An Aqimud Deen. They were all directed to make sure that they practice religion. Religion is what is required to be practiced by the followers of the prophets. That's what their responsibility was. This point of view also claims that Sunnah is only practice. That's what the word entails. Sunnah cannot be a statement. So, if we are talking about faith, if we are talking about a concept, we are not talking about Sunnah. It is only the practices, religious practices, which the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, gave this ummah that can be described as Sunnah. This point of view also claims that the Sunnah that we have been given is not to be derived from Hadith. Hadith is an important source, but a secondary source, and we'll talk about it in the next session. But Sunnah, like the Quran, has come down to us in the most authentic, reliable manner. It satisfies both criteria of ijma, unanimity, and tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. Like in the case of the Quran, likewise in the case of Sunnah, all Muslims of the first generation agreed to how prayers are to be said, for example, and what are going to be their timings, and so on. This practice then was taken up by the next generation, and then by the next one, and there was no interruption whatsoever. So like in the case of the Quran, similarly in the case of the Sunnah, we have both ijma and tawatur, unanimity and uninterrupted continuity. Both criteria have been completely satisfied and met. They say that this is what constitutes God's religion, the Quran and the Sunnah. So Sunnah is very much a part of God's religion, and it is absolutely reliable. It is practiced all over the world by all Muslims, all practicing religious Muslims. And like in the case of the Quran, in the case of Sunnah too, there is no dispute amongst Muslims as to what it is. Following this understanding, there is a concept which needs to be understood, which is the concept of bid'ah, religious innovation. Religious innovation is a practice which is claimed to be religious, but it does not proceed from the Prophet. As we have seen in these presentations, it is only the prophets who bring God's message, His religion. Religion cannot be derived from any other source. So, if there is a religious practice going on in some part of the Muslim world, which other Muslims in other parts of the world are not following, and there is no reliable, convincing way of believing that it was originated by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, then it has to be concluded that the practice is bid'ah. It is a religious innovation, and all religious innovations are condemnable in Islam, because God's religion comes from only God's messenger, God's prophet. Like nothing can be added to the Quran, nothing can be taken away from the Quran. Likewise, nothing can be added to the religious practices that were given by the Prophet, nor can anything be taken away from the Sunnah practices that we now have in a manner, in a way that it was given to us through ijma of the first generation, and then the uninterrupted continuity, tawatur, of the later generations.